Across modern times as well as ancient eras, once in a while investigators come across a case that is simply baffling. Try as they might, scouring every possible avenue and asking every possible question, they reach nothing but roadblocks. These cases, be them vehicle explosions, missing persons, bizarre items washed up on beaches, or unexplained deep water echoes, have remained unsolved for years, decades, heck even centuries. The paperwork of these mysteries has merely been collecting dust on detectives' desks. Until now. Be it the result of never-ending investigations or a fortunate piece of luck, we finally have answers to these once unsolved stories. Kicking things off, let's take a look at one of the most famous and most fiery aircraft disasters in history. In May of 1937, the hype around the Hindenburg airship was huge. Its makers claimed that it could cross the Atlantic in half the time of that of a boat. The hydrogen-filled airship had so much potential, but sadly failed miserably, exploding into uncontrollable flames in midair before crashing back down to Earth. Of the 100 people on board, 35 never made it out. For the better part of a century, this colossal disaster remained mostly a mystery. Scientists had a number of theories, including lightning, explosive paint properties, and the possibility of a bomb on board. But it wasn't until 2013 that we finally solved this case. A team of experts came to the conclusion that either a faulty gas valve or a broken wire caused hydrogen to leak into the ventilation shafts. Meanwhile, the entire airship had been charged with static electricity from a thunderstorm. The static caused a spark, which ignited the leaked hydrogen and ultimately proved to be the disaster's catalyst. 5 years after the notorious Hindenburg explosion, the world witnessed another terrible aviation disaster. On the 30th of October in 1942, an Avro Anson plane took off from an airfield in Patricia Bay in British Columbia for a routine navigation exercise. Just after leaving the runway, the plane and the 4 men on board vanished. The Canadian military carried out extensive searches, but not a single trace of the plane was found. The conclusion was that the plane had crashed, but the armed forces and the police couldn't find it anywhere. The Anson mystery carried over for 70 years before finally, in 2013, we started to uncover the truth. On Vancouver Island, a few workers from a logging company accidentally stumbled across the remains of both the plane and then one and then all of the passengers. While the cause of the crash is still fraught with uncertainty, poor weather is believed to have played a significant role. In 1995, 2 unnamed victims were discovered in New Britain, Connecticut. The police were hoping that the bodies could be quickly identified. However, nobody had reported anyone of similar description as missing, causing the investigation to reach a roadblock. It took until 2014, almost 2 decades later, for the answers to be revealed. Distant relatives of the victims, who were later discovered to be Elizabeth Haunch and her mother, Marcia Haunch, had called up the police and stated that they hadn't heard from the 2 women since 1995. Why weren't the police called earlier? Because the person most likely to have called the police, Elizabeth's mother and Marcia's partner, Robert Haunch, as it turns out, was the person who committed the crime. The police were granted a warrant to arrest Robert and put him behind bars. Robert had another daughter, Celeste Murillo, who lived with him in the early 1990s. Celeste was friendly with Elizabeth, her half-sister. Fortunately, Celeste managed to escape unscathed. The 1963 assassination of President John F. Kennedy in Dallas remains one of the most tragic and most notable political events in American history. Findings concluded that it was Lee Harvey Oswald who pulled the trigger. But in the aftermath of that fateful day, investigations became focused on another rather obscure element. Numerous photos from that day showed the blurry presence of the so-called Umbrella Man. Some suggested that the Umbrella Man's existence was proof of a conspiracy theory, perhaps using the umbrella as a means to signal a sniper. Others floated the idea that the umbrella concealed a poisoned dart gun. However, when the JFK case was reopened in the late 1970s, the mystery was solved. Our Umbrella Man had revealed himself as Louis Stephen Witt, a simple warehouse manager. Witt had a motive behind his umbrella. It was an homage to British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain's ever-present umbrella. JFK supported Chamberlain, and Chamberlain entered an appeasement agreement with the Germans. Simply put, Louis Stephen Witt's presence was a political statement, not a weapon. Has anybody out there ever been to Death Valley? The scorching desert is known as one of the hottest places in the world. Because of this immense heat, not much grows there, and except for driving through it, not much happens there. Except for one incredible phenomenon in the Racetrack Playa lakebed. Every decade or thereabouts, giant stones as heavy as 700 pounds have been tracked moving around on their own, leaving behind a clear and picturesque trail of their movement. This unique site has been observed since the 1940s, and yet it took until 2011 for researchers to finally understand the reason behind it. Here's the answer the scientists have been searching for. During the winter, the riverbed sometimes fills up with a thin layer of rainfall. Overnight, as temperatures drop, the layer of water freezes into thin sheets of ice. The next day, winds push the stones ever so slightly along the cracked ice. Their movement, at only a few inches per second, is slow enough that the human eye visitors can't notice it from a distance. From the searing heat of Death Valley to the frosty cold of the Antarctic waters, the puzzling ocean quack sound has been perplexing submarine radio systems for decades. Throughout the Southern Ocean, radios first picked up sounds that resembled quacking ducks about 55 years ago. They were nicknamed the bioduck, and until now, had no identified source. Some scientists speculated that the repetitive low-frequency noise was caused by the movement of ships, perhaps bumping into underwater ice, while others thought it may be coming from schools of fish. In 2013, the truth came to light. Acoustic devices were attached to two minke whales. Those devices recorded the whales making the strange noise, which means we now have conclusive evidence that the bioduck is in fact an Antarctic minke whale. Back in 1845, English explorer Sir John Franklin set sail for Canada with 128 crew members and 3 years' worth of food. His mission? To find an Arctic route connecting the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans. These days, that route is called the Northwest Passage. Right here, but back then it was unidentified. Rather than return with good news, Franklin and his crew simply vanished without a trace. Multiple search expeditions were sent out, over 30 in fact. 14 years after the initial vanishing, the first bones were found. But what happened? Two studies, one conducted by Canadian anthropologist Owen Beattie in the 1980s, and the other in 2013, came to this conclusion. First, the ships became stuck in Arctic ice. Unable to free them from their entrapment, the explorers succumbed not to starvation or cold, but to disease such as tuberculosis. In 2014, a Canadian robot submarine located the wreckage of one of Franklin's ships under the Arctic ice. This isn't the only case of an icy shipwreck. In the early morning hours of the 15th of April in 1912, the ill-fated RMS Titanic collided with an iceberg in the Atlantic Ocean during its maiden voyage. For decades, the explanation appeared relatively simple. Captain Edward Smith and his crew ignored other ships' warnings about icebergs in their path and decided to continue full steam ahead anyway. The Titanic scraped an iceberg which ripped a hole into the hull, inviting water into the ship, and started the chain reaction that led to its sinking. Apart from that storyline, its sinking has been peppered with uncertainty. However, recent evidence suggests that the reason the ship sank wasn't solely the iceberg, but rather a fire burning out of control in the coal room, one which was weakening the hull just days before the ship departed. We've got an entire video about that actually. Check it out after you finish this one. The link is in the description. From something fraught with tragedy to something that'll give you a bit of a laugh, let's head on over to the picturesque Iroise coast of Brittany. That's this area in northwestern France. For close to 40 years, the most peculiar thing has been washing up Brittany's beaches. Over and over again, locals have stumbled across bright orange, novelty Garfield telephones. Sometimes they're merely fragments and sometimes they're fully intact. Either way, it's a little weird, that's for sure. So where are all these cartoon cats coming from? As it turns out, back in 1983, a cargo ship carrying a crate full had one of its containers swept off. The container had become lodged in a secluded coastal 100-foot-deep cave under the cliffs of Plourzel. Winding the clock all the way back to the year 217 BCE, Pharaoh Ptolemy IV of Egypt declared war on the Seleucid ruler Antiochus III. This battle featured a unique weapon, war elephants. A Greek historian named Polybius described the events. He stated that on the one hand, Antiochus was using Indian elephants. On the other hand, Ptolemy was using African elephants. But the historian described the Indian elephants to be larger, which is not the case. All sorts of explanations were offered to justify Polybius's historical account, with most agreeing that even though Pharaoh Ptolemy did use African elephants, he couldn't find any larger savanna herds and was forced to resort to smaller forest herds instead. Alas, we now know the truth. Polybius simply got it wrong, and until well into the 19th century, his ancient accounts were accepted, wrongly, as fact. But Polybius wasn't actually at the battle, and wrote his account some 70 years later based on stories and myths. Don't go anywhere just yet, people, because we've got a quick bonus feature for you. Check it out. On Christmas Eve in 1492, Columbus's flagship, the Santa Maria, sank, forcing the famous explorer to make his way back to Europe on board an alternate ship, the Nina. For hundreds of years, Santa Maria, one of the most historically valuable shipwrecks, was lost. But then, underwater archaeologist Barry Clifford made the breakthrough. Dives undertaken early in 2019 confirmed that a ship located off Haiti's north coast was identical in size to the Santa Maria, and Clifford even found a cannon that matched those reportedly carried by Columbus. Ironically, Clifford and his team had already discovered and photographed it years prior, but they didn't realize what it was. Are there any other unsolved mysteries that you can think of? Share them in the comments. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and as always,